Right, so picture this, like a small act of defiance, something that might even seem kind of theatrical at the time, but it ends up lighting the fuse and changing the entire course of history. We're going deep today into the Boston Tea Party, and you've brought some really interesting sources, everything from like Wikipedia and museum websites to some like contemporary news accounts, even stuff from the UK National Archives.
Yeah, it's fascinating how this seemingly local thing, this dispute over tea, I mean, of all things, it explodes into this huge symbolic moment with consequences that literally went global.
For sure. And today we're going to really try to break down what happened on December 16th, 1773. Like, why did it matter so much? And maybe even debunk some of the myths that have grown up around it. We'll look at what led up to that night, the details of the protest itself, reactions on both sides of the Atlantic, and then the long-lasting legacy that it left. By the end of this, you'll have a way better grasp of this whole pivotal event.
Yeah.
So let's set the stage right. What's the situation leading up to this?
Well, the British East India Company is key to understanding this. By the 1770s, they were under some serious financial strain. The Bengal famine hit their revenue from India pretty hard, but they also had this massive surplus of tea just sitting in warehouses back in Britain. This oversupply, it's a major factor in everything that unfolds.
Okay, so then we get to the Tea Act of 1773. Now, this is where things get kind of tricky, because I think a lot of people assume this was all about Britain just jacking up the taxes on tea. But the sources paint a more complex picture, don't they?
Right. The main goal of the Tea Act wasn't really about raising taxes. It was designed to bail out the East India Company, which was struggling. The act let the company ship tea directly to the American colonies and sell it through their own agents, so they could bypass those London wholesalers. And on top of that, the company got a rebate on import duties they paid in Britain for tea that was then shipped to America. So the thinking was this would actually make legally imported British tea cheaper for the colonists.
So if the tea could actually be cheaper, then what made the colonists so furious? What was the real problem if it wasn't the price?
The heart of the matter was this principle of no taxation without representation. The colonists believed very strongly that they should only be taxed by their own elected assemblies, not by the British Parliament, where they had no say. So even though the Tea Act could have made tea cheaper, it's important to remember that the Townshend duty on tea, that small tax of 3 pence per pound, it stayed in place. For the colonists, that remaining duty was a blatant symbol that Parliament was claiming the right to tax them without their consent, and that was unacceptable.
I see. So it wasn't just the economics of it. It was about a much bigger principle of self-governance. And it sounds like other folks had their own reasons to be upset about the Tea Act too, right?
Exactly. Think about the colonial tea merchants and also all the people involved in smuggling Dutch tea. The East India Company's new monopoly and their ability to sell directly was a big threat to both groups. The legal merchants, they're worried about being undercut on price. And the smugglers are facing more competition from a now cheaper legal source. So you get this weird alliance against the Tea Act driven by both constitutional principles and economic self-interest.
So we've got this brewing resistance across the colonies. How did other colonies react to the Tea Act? And what made Boston the flashpoint?
Well, a bunch of other colonies like New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, they all saw big protests against the Tea Act. In a lot of these places, the colonists managed to pressure those tea consignees, the agents appointed by the East India Company to receive and sell the tea. They forced them to resign. In Philly and New York, they even got the tea ships to turn around and head back to England without unloading anything. In Charleston, they unloaded the tea but then just let it rot in warehouses. But Boston was different because of the royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson. He was determined to uphold British authority, and he wouldn't let the tea ships leave until those duties were paid. Plus, the tea consignees in Boston included 2 of Hutchinson's own sons, which just made them even more stubborn. So this unyielding stance in Boston, it set the stage for a real showdown.
So the tea ships start showing up in Boston Harbor in late November 1773. What happens next in this whole drama?
Right. The first ship, the Dartmouth, arrives on November 28th, and then the Eleanor and the Beaver show up soon after. Under British customs rules, those ships had 20 days to unload their cargo and pay the duties. If they missed the deadline, customs officials could legally seize the tea. This ticking clock created a sense of urgency and amped up the pressure on both sides.
And I imagine the colonists didn't just sit around and wait for that deadline to pass.
Well,
we hear about these huge public meetings, right?
Absolutely. Whig leaders, especially Samuel Adams, organized these big meetings to figure out how to deal with those tea ships. The first one was at Faneuil Hall, but so many people showed up that they had to move to the Old South Meeting House, which was way bigger. These meetings were crucial for getting public support and coordinating their response. And one of the main things they did was pass a resolution demanding that the captain of the Dartmouth take his ship and all that tea back to England without paying any duties. They even set up a watch to make sure he didn't try to unload anything.
But Governor Hutchinson stood his ground. He wouldn't give the Dartmouth permission to leave without pulling those duties.
Yeah.
This is getting tense, like a real battle of wills.
Yeah, and as that 20-day deadline for the Dartmouth gets closer on December 16th, they have another massive meeting at the Old South Meeting House. Some estimates say there are like 5,000 to 7,000 people there, and when word comes back that Hutchinson is still refusing to let the ships go, Samuel Adams makes his famous statement, "This meeting can do nothing further to save the country."
And this is often seen as the prearranged signal for the colonists to take action, right? Like the spark that starts the whole Tea Party.
Well, it's a dramatic story that gets told a lot, but the historical evidence about Adams's statement being a deliberate signal, it's a little shaky. Sure, Adams was a key figure in the resistance, but those eyewitness accounts from the time, they don't really confirm that he was giving a direct order to go destroy the tea. Some historians even think the action that followed was more spontaneous, like a sudden outburst of frustration from the crowd rather than something planned in advance.
Interesting. So signal or no signal, what actually goes down on the evening of December 16th, 1773?
So as that meeting at the Old South Meeting House breaks up this group of guys, maybe 30 to 130 of them, they head down to Griffin's Wharf, and a lot of them disguise themselves as Mohawk warriors. Now, that choice of disguise was really symbolic. Obviously, they wanted to hide their identities because what they were doing was illegal. But dressing as Native Americans, it was also a powerful way of showing their American identity, their connection to the land, and their difference from British rule.
It's a striking image, right? These colonists putting on Native American garb to protest British authority on their own soil.
Yeah, and they boarded the 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. And over the next 3 hours, they systematically destroyed all that tea. They tossed 342 chests of tea into the harbor, which is something like 92,000 pounds of tea.
Wow, that's a ton of tea. What was the financial hit to the East India Company? Like, how much was all that tea worth?
At the time, the company valued the lost tea at almost 9,659 pounds. And if you adjust for inflation, that's about $1.7 million in today's money. So yeah, a huge financial blow. And just for context, Griffin's Wharf, where all this went down, is near where Pearl Street and Atlantic Avenue are in Boston today.
I can only imagine the scene at the harbor that night. I even read somewhere that the smell of tea hung over the harbor for weeks.
That's true. There are accounts from back then that describe the harbor being filled with tea leaves and broken chests for quite a while. And there's even this kind of funny story about some revolutionaries having to row out in boats and keep pushing the floating tea under the water to make sure it was ruined and couldn't be salvaged.
So it wasn't just those 3 ships at Griffin's Wharf that got hit, right?
Yeah.
There was that other ship, the William, too.
Oh, right. The William was another tea ship headed for Boston, but it ran aground on Cape Cod that December. They salvaged the tea, paid the import duties on it, and sold it off to private buyers. But then in March of 1774, the Sons of Liberty found out that this tea was being stored in a warehouse and a shop in Boston. So they dressed up as Mohawks, again broke in, and dumped the rest of the tea into the harbor.
So after this dramatic tea dumping, what was the reaction? Like back in the colonies and over in Britain?
Well, back in the colonies, the reaction was mixed. Samuel Adams, no surprise, there was quick to defend the Tea Party. He said it wasn't just lawlessness, it was a necessary protest against unfair taxes. And John Adams, his cousin, he was even more excited. He wrote in his diary that the Boston Tea Party was the most magnificent movement of all. He saw how historically important it was right from the start.
I bet the reaction in Britain was a little less enthusiastic, though.
Understatement of the year. Even people in Britain who'd been sympathetic to the colonists before, they were shocked by this blatant destruction of property. It really turned public and political opinion against the colonists. Prime Minister Lord North, he captured that sentiment when he said, "Whatever may be the consequence, we must risk something. If we do not, all is over." Clearly, the British were taking a much harder line now.
And the British response was swift and harsh, right? That's where the Intolerable Acts come in.
You got it. In 1774, Parliament passed a series of laws kind of coercive acts in Britain, but the colonists quickly nicknamed them the Intolerable Acts. They included the Boston Port Act, which shut down Boston Harbor to all trade until the East India Company got paid back for their tea. Then there was the Massachusetts Government Act, which basically stripped away a lot of self-government in the colony and put it under stricter royal control. And there were other laws that let British officials accused of crimes in the colonies be tried back in Britain instead of Massachusetts.
Those acts don't sound like they'd exactly calm things down.
Nope, they had the opposite effect. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, the Intolerable Acts made colonists throughout all 13 colonies feel like their basic rights and freedoms were under attack. They saw it as a violation of their charters. It actually brought them together and strengthened the movement for a united resistance. Even Benjamin Franklin, who was initially hesitant about such extreme actions, he suggested that the East India Company should be paid back for the tea. Some New York merchants even offered to pay for the damages, but Lord North rejected their offer.
It's amazing how this one event led to such a rapid escalation. Were there other protests that were directly inspired by the Boston Tea Party?
Yeah, there were a few others that followed a similar pattern, like the burning of the Peggy Stewart in Annapolis, Maryland, where they also destroyed a shipment of tea. The British government did try to smooth things over later by repealing the tea tax in 1778, but by then it was way too late. The relationship was broken, and the colonies were already on the road to war.
Looking back now, how has the Boston Tea Party been viewed and interpreted over time? What's its legacy?
At first it wasn't widely called the Boston Tea Party. It was more often referred to as the destruction of the tea. The name Boston Tea Party really took off in the early 1800s when the event became a more central and celebrated part of American history. And it's interesting that some historians think there was some initial reluctance to fully embrace an event where they intentionally destroyed private property. It kind of clashed with the values of the time.
That makes sense. It's not like property destruction is usually seen as a heroic thing.
Right. But as the story of the American Revolution was told and retold, the Boston Tea Party became a powerful and enduring symbol of colonial resistance against tyranny. Today, you have the Boston Tea Party ships and museum, which is a really cool interactive experience. You can actually take part in a reenactment of the tea dumping and see a real tea chest from that time. They even have full-scale replicas of the Eleanor and the Beaver, which really brings the whole thing to life.
Sounds like a great way to experience history firsthand. And it's not just in museums, right? The Boston Tea Party has been used as a symbol in all sorts of protests throughout history, hasn't it?
Oh yeah, it's become a common analogy for standing up against injustice, both in the US and internationally. You see its influence in the words of people like Mahatma Gandhi during India's fight for independence, in protests against Richard Nixon during Watergate, and even in the name and imagery of the modern Tea Party movement in American politics. Just last year, in 2023, they had a big 250th anniversary reenactment, so it's definitely still relevant today.
It's become a part of our culture, really. Even the fact that America switched from tea to coffee after the Revolution is sometimes linked at least partly to anti-British feelings after the Boston Tea Party.
That's a popular theory. And while there were probably lots of reasons why coffee became more popular, the association of tea with Britain definitely played a role in making coffee seem more American. And here's a cool fact. The American Antiquarian Society actually has a vial of what they believe is harbor water with tea in it from 1773. A little piece of history from that night.
Wow, that's incredible. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Boston Tea Party, what's the key takeaway for our listeners?
I think the most important thing is that the Boston Tea Party was way more than just a protest about the price of tea. It was a powerful, symbolic act of defiance. It showed how much the colonists opposed what they saw as an unjust system of taxation and a violation of their rights. It was a major turning point that pushed the colonies closer to revolution and ultimately shaped the course of American history.
And when you really look at it, there were so many different perspectives involved. The colonists fighting for their right to govern themselves. The British government trying to assert its control and support a big trading company. The East India Company struggling with its own financial problems. It's a complex web of motivations and interests that all came together that night in Boston Harbor.
Totally. And what might seem like a small local protest in a colonial port, it had huge and lasting global repercussions. It helped give birth to a new nation and change the balance of power in the world.
It really makes you think about the power of collective action and what happens when people stand up for what they believe in. Think about the protests and acts of civil disobedience we see happening today. How will they be viewed by future generations? And what long-term effects might they have? If you want to learn more about this crucial moment in history, we strongly suggest checking out the Boston Tea Party ships and museum. You can visit in person or explore their website. And of course, there are tons of books and articles out there. Reading about the intolerable acts is a great way to understand more about the path to revolution. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.